So again, we have properties that, at least, as I would like to say next, presuppose that there is a subject to whom certain things appear to be in a certain way, and to whom something can be given. Okay. Now, where am I? Sorry. Yeah, I'm the second part, about a subject presupposing concepts. Well, I've already been using this term subject, and well, in my view, this is the most important and the deepest part of the problem about consciousness, and I won't be able to say a lot about how I think myself about it. I'd just like to stress the following. It seems to me that in our thinking about others, not only when we attribute experiences in the sense of sensory experiences or emotional experiences and so on to them, but also when we attribute to them expectations, wondering, they are expecting something, they are anticipating something, they are thinking about something, and so on. We think of them as subjects. And I would like to express this in the following way. There are certain concepts that are concepts of properties that presuppose that the one to whom you ascribe it is a subject. And I call them subject presupposing concepts. And our language and our thought, more importantly, is shot through with those concepts, right? What does it take? I wrote a few things on the handout in order to make it more understandable what I have in mind. So there is a part of the handout that starts: a concept of a property is a subject presupposing property. And it goes on like this: if and only if its attribution to an individual presupposes that the individual is a subject, is a conscious being. So my view here is that when you attribute those properties, you already employ or use a general concept of a subject. And when I say a general concept of a subject, I mean a concept that makes the difference between someone being there and no one being there. Not in the sense of there being a person, because there are many, many subjects that are not people and not human beings. And I think that this concept is even present in the way we perceive. So when you look at the whale, I think even if you look at the whale at that distance, you perceive it as a subject, I would like to claim. You perceive it as actively hopping up. Yeah? And in some way, you are aware of the fact that there is someone to whom the world is presented in a particular way. And that's why it's so nice to look at him, because you're aware of a completely different being, having a completely different world that you will never be able to know. And that's so nice and so wonderful and so touching, right? And nothing would be touching about, for instance, observing birds if you were not perceiving them as subjects, as centers of their world, so to speak. So that's what I have in mind intuitively when I talk of subject presupposing concepts. I think that when we attribute agency, we are using subject presupposing concepts. When I say, oh, Dirk said yesterday to me such and such, I presuppose that he did this actively and that it was an action of him. If I say Robert said such and such, and if I do not believe he's a subject in that sense, then I'm misusing language, in my view. So concepts attributed in thinking, wondering, as I said already, are subject presupposing. And maybe something a little bit more theoretical I would like to say. If you try to positively conceive of a case where someone instantiates a subject presupposing, now, a property that you understand by a concept that is subject presupposing, then in some sense you try to understand it, or you conceive of it from the first person perspective, right? So even if when you talk about anticipating and wondering, you somehow take the perspective of the individual to whom you are attributing it and are trying to understand it in the way it is, on the basis of the way it is for that being to instantiate that property. Then there's a lot of bit to be said about how we understand subjects with respect to their individuality and their identity across time. I'm not going into this, but I think that this is very important to get an adequate understanding of what it is to attribute subject presupposing, to use, sorry, I'm also always oscillating between the concepts and the properties, to attribute properties using subject presupposing concepts. Now, I'm almost ready. What does this have to do with our discussion? So my diagnosis, and this is for me the big insight that I have achieved myself during this cruise, and it goes in the direction exactly what Dan said in one of his mails before the cruise, that he would like to happen. Not that we agree in the end, but that we succeed in understanding each other a bit better than we did before. Now, what I believe is an insight, maybe you don't agree at all, is the following. I think that those people who try a reduction of phenomenal consciousness or of consciousness tout court, when they formulate the basis to which they want to reduce, they often talk about cognitive structure, right? And then they use certain concepts in describing that cognitive structure. And my observation is this. I'm certain that in using those concepts, they have very often implicitly a subject presupposing reading of those concepts in mind. Okay? So in whose paper was this? So yeah, I thought in your paper this was quite evident to me when you were talking about having non-inferential access to one's own properties. It's extremely tempting when one wonders now about your thesis. Could I have immediate non-inferential access to the fact that I'm visually aware of something without also being inclined to say that I'm phenomenally aware? So now I engage in first-person thought. So I do interpret what you said in the subject presupposing manner. But I'm not allowed to do this. And I'm not allowed to do this. Why? Because a reduction to something that is expressed in subject presupposing terms is not a reduction that helps the physicalist or the materialist. Because the most important problem is still there, the subject. Okay? Why is it? That's one way in which it leads to an illusion, and you have this on the handout as one of the last 2 points. The other way it leads to an illusion is that we are misguided when we intuitively test such a reduction. Yeah? It may appear very plausible that when and so on, the story that I just told. But then I'm misled because I'm not thinking in concepts that are not subject presupposing. And what I am supposed to test is whether we can reduce what we want to reduce, maybe an experiential property, to something that can be expressed, fully expressed, without any loss, in concepts that do not presuppose that there is a subject there. Right? So they're not subject presupposing properties. So my very last remark is Paul there? No, he's not there. Okay, it's a bit with respect to something that he said in discussion, and of course he said in his writings also, and many of you, I think, share this, namely the view that in principle all concepts that we use in order to describe reality are revisable in the light of empirical science, right? And I think most of you think that this is true also for those concepts that we use in order to think about ourselves, to think about experiential properties and to think about experiencing subjects. So my view is, and I won't have time to argue for this, but my view is that the very notion of an experiencing subject is not at all open to revision. Okay, and that's for the discussion.
I'm looking around to see.
Behind you, Andy.
Yeah, Andy, go ahead. I'll move out. Sorry.
So I thought that was great, and I agree with very many of the things that you're saying there. Just in terms of your comments on the direct non-inferential access thing, the kind of goal there was, if you like, to diagnose the origins of the kind of temptation towards the philosophical notion of quality that you yourself were rejecting. So it wasn't, as it were, a reductive project there, it was to diagnose the origins of those intuitions. So in that case, I think it's actually quite convivial to what you're saying.
Okay.
The question that your kind of positive proposal then raises in me is, I think that's right, kind of shift the explanatory question towards understanding subjects and the stuff that is in some way presented to them, the stuff that subjects know about. And so I suppose my question then is, did our problem get any easier? Have we, what does this mean for the concrete project? Because if you ask me, how do you go about building a robot that is a genuine subject, for example, I don't know any more about that really than I know about how do I go about building a robot that is a genuine haver of phenomenal experiences or whatever. So I build robots sometimes and I don't know if they're subjects or not.
Well, as you may know, I'm not involved in the business of constructing a materialist theory of consciousness. And I think, and precisely because I think the notion of a subject brings up so deep and difficult problems, that there really is no materialist theory that can be acceptable. So I'm a dualist, okay? But I don't think that being a dualist, in the sense I have in mind, makes me someone who believes in magic or mysteries or the supernatural. I'm a naturalist. I'm a naturalist. I think that subjects of experience are products of nature. Of course they are.
But what kind of thing makes it the case that some things are and some things aren't?
I wish I would know more about it, but there are so many things that we don't understand about reality, also about physical reality. If you read about Bell's theorem, I mean, isn't that completely crazy? It's much less crazy than having the idea that at some level, well, there's someone. Astonishing, yeah, but wonderful.
And
that nature is like that.
So that
that's something we talked about after a few glasses of wine, and I still agree with what I said. I think that the notion of a subject forces us to think that there must be a cutoff, a clear cutoff, that at some point, there's someone. Now, I'm not sure. I'm a bit between two tendencies. One is to say that can't be. It must be a continuum. And that would mean that with respect to this particular question, whether there are borderline cases, our notion of a subject is not adequate. I still think we are not able to revise it. Even if we say there must be something like that, because we are not able to make sense of it, to positively conceive of what it might be to be something in between a subject and a non-subject. We are just not able to do that. And the other tendency is to say, well, why shouldn't nature be that way? Why not? I mean, it might be that at some point, certainly not at a certain specific point, which is the same in everyone, but at some point, when you have a child, for instance, you have someone inside your body, and there he is. Yeah.
Nick?
Martina, I liked it very much as well, but I wonder whether there isn't some kind of inversion going on again here. When you talk about presupposing, why should we presuppose the subject? Why shouldn't it be the case that the subject comes into being with the experience? And I mean, Frege, I'm sure you know that passage, I can't quote it directly, when he says it's absurd to imagine the idea of thoughts or ideas roaming the world without a subject. An idea presupposes the idea of the person for whom it is that idea. But you could equally say it's absurd to imagine subjects roaming the world without experiences. Can you conceive of a subject who is not at that point the subject of an experience? And the way I've often thought about it is that actually this is it's a kind of loop in which the experience creates the subject, who then becomes the subject of the experience. And I think that's, I mean, in terms of actually the development of selfhood and personhood and identity within a human being, that's actually the way it goes.
I'm not quite sure I understand. Is the view that there are experiences first, temporarily?
No, I think that you can't have either one or the other. That's why I don't like your word presupposing.
I see. Well, but I'm saying you cannot have. Well, I'm not saying you cannot have a subject without experience, because it depends on how you understand experience. If thought is not an experience, no, then I think. Okay, good. But then I think there's no disagreement between us, because what I wanted to say when I said presuppose is something conceptual, that you cannot make sense of what it is for an experience to occur without thinking a subject to whom something is. And
so that was Frege's point, but I think that actually it's also true the other way around, and that's why this is an exchange which is going on.
The notion of a subject without understanding what it is to experience something. That's okay for me. I'm not sure if it's true, but it's not in conflict with what I wanted to say. Not at all.
Martina, I want to pick up on a point that Andy made. When he said, if I want to make a robot. And as I was listening to you, I thought, this reminds me of why I so often revert to robot talk, because I think it opens up a challenge to fill the gap between you and me. Like Andy, I agree with a lot of what you say, especially your dismissal of philosophical qualities. Of course, music to my
ears. I would have expected.
Yeah. So good. But I'm not convinced that your positive account of what you call
subject presupposing property.
Presented qualia. But here's what I tell me when you disagree with this. If you look at a bacterium moving around under a microscope, to me, there's a wonderfully eerie sense there's nobody home. It's just a little robot. And what each individual human living body is about 100 trillion of those. And not a single one of them is conscious or knows what it's doing, and it doesn't know who you are, and they are robots made of robots made of robots. Now, it seems if you're a good naturalist, you are pretty well bound to accept that there is a complete account of the trajectory of all the parts of a living body, which is accountable in terms of the interaction of all of those little robots. So then where does the subject presupposing properties come in? I submit it comes in when a large clump of those robots starts talking to you, for instance, and you take it seriously as an interlocutor. Now you adopt heterophenomenology towards that complicated bunch. And if the issue arises, are you making a mistake because might it be a zombie? That's a big mistake, because there is no distinction between a zombie and a conscious person. In both cases, the subject presupposing way of treating that entity is utterly natural, involuntary, and there's no way of telling them apart.
That's another issue, whether I can tell them apart. So I guess that's one of the fundamental problems one would have to talk about if there was more time. I think that we do have to make the distinction between what evidence we could possibly have for a certain claim and what constitutes that the claim is true in a particular case. And I make that distinction. And I would agree that, of course, if I had one of those zombies that Dave is imagining in front of me, I would not be able to make the difference. But still, it's an interesting, substantial hypothesis. Is there someone in the sense of a subject, so in the sense that it's adequate to think of him in what I call the first person mode? That's a substantial issue about that creature.
How can that be a substantial issue?
How can there be? Just try to understand the difference between someone where there is a true story to be told from its perspective and someone where there's no such story to be told, because there is no such story. There is nothing that is phenomenally present or in any other way present to that being. But let me maybe just say a few more words about this robot issue. Up to a certain point, I can completely agree with what you said. Of course, I believe that all this stuff going on in my body and then brain and so on brings it about that there is me, that there is a subject of experience in a substantial way. So in that sense, I'm a good naturalist. Of course I do believe that. We don't have any idea about how that might work. We cannot describe a mechanism how this will work, and I think we won't ever have. But why do we expect that? It seems to me that when we understand what the difference is, the substantial difference I'm talking about, between a robot who became a subject and a robot who didn't, then we can see that there cannot be a mechanism that explains this, and that it's a false expectation. Why should we have this capacity to understand? Although we have so many cases in nature where we do not get that kind of understanding. We should just say, okay, it's like this, and let's try to find out when it happens, on what basis it happens. That's all accessible, I think. That's another story why I think it's accessible. But I must say one more thing, because this is something that I really find important. When people talk about constructing robots, and they are so excited about constructing robots that might be subjects and so on. I mean, do you really think you have a right to do that? If you believe they are subjects in our sense, then you should hesitate. Then you should say, oh, I don't know what I'm bringing about here. I don't know what kind of world I'm producing. Okay. I think go on with your robot stuff, because you won't be able to do it.
There's another set of issues, but I don't think there's a tension between this thing that you say we can understand how to build it, and then we won't know whether we've got one or not once we have.
I think we can learn a lot about what the basis of consciousness is in our own case, and then we can have very well supported, empirically supported hypotheses what we would have to do with a robot. It's not a robot anymore in a certain sense, but with anything, with a system, in order to make it conscious. But we should be aware of what we are doing there, and I think that some people who are not aware of them using those subject presupposing concepts all the time, they are under the illusion that they are talking about, oh, it's a bit more complicated, and then it says, wow, 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 when it comes to something that it doesn't like. And that wouldn't be a problem. I would have no problem to construct something like that. But wait a moment, does it really have a subjective perspective on the world? If it does, then be careful.
But we'll never know.
There's one word in one of your sentences. If I simply adjust it very slightly, then I can agree with you. And also I can help you with your problem about graded consciousness. Under what is required for realism about phenomenal consciousness, your second sentence is, if you accept that beliefs involving e-phenomenal concepts are sometimes true, you are a realist about phenomenal consciousness. I want to take that word true and put scare quotes on it. And
that's not a little thing to do.
Well, but it is in a way, because the very thing you're talking about, when people in robotics, when they use intentional language, they know exactly what they mean. I don't think they're confused at all.
No,
they find this an extremely efficient way of making sense of an extraordinarily complex organism.
I agree.
And this will be the case as we go ever more complicated into more and more complicated robots. And you're still holding out for, at some point, you either have it or you don't. And I think that that is the illusion. That
But
there
what
is
was this? I didn't understand.
that at some point there is either a subject there or there isn't.
Look, this is
And
not
that
so
is the
important.
illusion, I think. And I think it's
Okay.
an artifact of the way you're thinking
Look, if
about
this
it.
is the illusion, that's not so exciting. I mean, as I said, it might be an illusion that there must be a cutoff point. But when we are talking about clear cases, then it's a substantial issue. If you have a very complicated system in front of you, maybe an extraterrestrial, maybe something that is in part artificial and in part biological, and you are in serious doubt what kind of individual you have in front of you, then it's one thing if you are very successful in descriptions using intentional vocabulary and saying, oh, now it's seeing me, now it wants to hunt me, and so on. Of course you can do this. But even if you do this successfully, it's still an open question whether you should understand it in a subject presupposing way, in the sense that you are doing duty to what you have in front of you. Is it really an experiencing subject? Is there a world seen from its perspective or not? And I don't talk about perspectives that cameras can have, okay? I'm talking about there being someone to whom something is present. And this is a substantial issue. I'm just insisting this is a substantial issue.
It can be true. We can't know the answer.
I'm sorry?
But just to be clear, you don't think we can know the answer?
I think that in future, why not? Of course. I think that when we make progress about the basis of consciousness, then in the future, not now, yeah, then certainly, I would say, we will have very good reason.
I really just end this question. I mean, suppose you fell into a coma and you woke up in...
I don't hear you, I'm sorry.
Suppose you fell into a coma and you woke up in, let's say, 500 years, and you emerged into a world which seemed to be populated with people exactly like us, and you interacted with them in exactly the way you're interacting with us. They look just like us.
The robots, you say, or what? I didn't understand the beginning.
I'd say, suppose you fall into a coma.
Into a coma.
Or somehow you're transported into the future.
Yes.
And you wake up and you're in a world populated with people exactly like us. And you interact with them and everything is exactly the same to interactions with us. You'd have no doubt that these people are subjects. Okay. But then suppose it's revealed to you that in fact 50% of the population are artificially created. Yeah. They might be made of artificial materials, they might have been artificially created out of biological materials. You think that it's an open question that half the population are not subjects, and that we can never tell that...
No, I don't say that we can never tell. Because I don't now have any idea about what the material itself or the fact that it's a biological product plays a role in bringing about consciousness. I do believe that in the future, we will find out, I think, a lot more about the basis of consciousness in ourselves. Okay? Right. Now, I guess what you are saying is that I cannot be certain whether it is functional, the function that makes the difference, or the stuff it is made of that makes the difference. I'm not sure if there's no empirical way to find that out.
Could you give me an experiment?
You tried a telepathy test.
I'm sorry?
Turing suggested, it's not clear if it was a joke, but what you would do is to just do a test for telepathy. And if you could communicate telepathically, it would be a real subject.
Yeah, but that's not an answer to the question. I mean,
telepathy.
I'm sorry?
Forgetting about telepathy, could you think of any way of testing whether a certain set of materials were capable of creating a subject? Suppose one of these...
Not on the basis of what we know now. I would not exclude that we might know more about the basis of consciousness in the future. Maybe we find out some things about biological development, biological material that somehow...
What kind of things might we find out about those materials that would make the link to subjectivity?
That we find they play a certain role in the basis of consciousness in our own brain.
In ourselves, yes.
Yeah.
But suppose then we have this artificial creature.
Then we look whether we find the same basis there.
Well, we won't. Well, okay. Suppose it's made out of artificial materials. Okay, it's not made. It's made out of very different materials from us. Let's suppose this creature insists adamantly that it is a subject, but it doesn't have the same basis that we have. It has a totally different basis, let's suppose. Now, and suppose we have a theory that says, well, you need our basis. Are we going to say, no, you're wrong, you're not a subject?
No, and certainly I'm not going to.
So, but maybe it isn't.
I'm not committed at all.
Well, so how could we tell whether it? I just don't see how we get any grip on this.
We cannot decide it now. We cannot decide now. We cannot decide now whether we will ever have any way to distinguish in the future, because we do not know enough about what we might find about the basis of consciousness in the future, whether we will have good theories that include that there must be something biological. My personal opinion is that it would be very strange if the mere fact that it's biological makes a difference to whether there's a subject or not. And if you ask me what I would believe that they are conscious. Of course I would.
Well, we all, yes, we all.
Yeah?
Yes,
But not because I say they behave that way, but because I think that would be very strange if nature, reality is such that it brings about systems that work exactly like we do functionally and everything, behave exactly like that, and they are not.
But I don't see what grounds you have for thinking that, if given your view. I mean, yes, you would be highly confident, and the fact that you'd be highly confident of it tells me something about how we think about subjectivity and consciousness, and that it's heterophenomenological. But I don't see what basis you would have for thinking that, because I can't see any purchase one level gives you on the other.
I assume that there are nomological, how do you say? There are laws of nature that are responsible for whether there's a subject or not. And I assume that we will find something out about those laws, so that in the future we will have good reason in those cases. But still, certainly we can be skeptic, but I think not much more than in the case of you.
I just don't see how we can
Okay, Philip is back, and it is time for Philip to thank you very much, Martina.